The stage did not stop long enough for a woman to be sure of her footing. Grisha Van Dyke stepped down into the dust of a Texas rail town called Delwood in the spring of 1887 with a milk pail in one hand and her dead father's Winchester laid across her shoulder like a yoke she had carried so long she no longer felt the weight of it. She was 31 years old. She had eaten cold biscuit off a stranger's wagon board, slept sitting up against a mail sack, and answered a plain worded advertisement she could not fully read in a paper she could not afford to keep. The driver did not wait. He set her trunk in the road, clicked his tongue at the mule, and was gone before the grit had settled on her boots. She did not watch him go. She was already reading the town. Frank Halloran had placed the advertisement in the Amarillo Weekly Courier because he had run out of every other thing a man runs out of before he runs out of pride. He needed a capable woman to milk the cows and salt the beef for 90 days. He did not know he had just hired the person who would read his dying land better than he ever had. The general store woman watched her through the glass the way people in small towns watch when they think they are being subtle. Two men outside the feed store talked without looking at each other, and one of them said the name Halloran in the low way men say a thing they have already decided about. Grisha heard it. She filed that away. She had learned young that a town tells you everything if you let it talk over your shoulder and you keep your own mouth shut. She stood in the road a while with her trunk and her pail and her father's rifle. She was not waiting the way a woman waits to be rescued. She was waiting the way a woman waits to be certain nobody came for a slow half hour. And the sun tipped gold across the false-fronted street, and still she stood, and still she read. Then a wagon came in off the west road, a buckboard drawn by one tired mule, driven by an old man with gray at his temples and a battered hat pulled low. He drew up short of her and looked at her the way a man looks at weather he does not trust. His knees, she would learn, had opinions about certain kinds of weather. His name was Cale, and he had done the work of two men on the Halloran place for 11 years, through the good and through the ruin. You'd be the Dutch woman, Cale said. It was not a question. He did not get down to help her. So she did not wait to be helped. She swung her trunk up onto the buckboard before he had finished deciding whether to offer, set the pail beside it, laid the Winchester across her knees when she climbed up, and looked straight ahead down the west road as though she had ridden it 100 times. Cale watched all of that without a word. Something in the set of his shoulders eased by a half-inch. He clicked at the mule. They went west into the low sun without speaking, and the town fell away behind them into its own dust. Her father had been a Frisian dairyman and a poor one, and then a poor Iowa homesteader, and then he had died on a hard piece of borrowed ground with nothing to leave her but a Winchester rifle and the whole of a working education. She had learned to read a ledger before she learned to read Scripture. She had learned to read a cow's condition off the shine of its coat, and to read water off the color of grass, and to read a piece of land the way other people read a face, for what it was hiding and what it was about to do. None of it had been worth $1 to anyone until now. A woman with that kind of knowing and no husband and no land of her own was, to most of the world, only a pair of hands for hire. She had let the world think so. It was cheaper than arguing. The land came up slow. It was high plains country, blue stem and buffalo grass gone winter pale, and only now greening at the roots, a creek that ran low but ran, a far ridge the color of a bruise fading. She counted fence posts out of habit and found 11 of them leaning where a man had set them to stand. She counted cattle scattered thin across a pasture that could have carried 3 times what stood on it. She counted, and she said nothing, and Cale watched her counting and filed that away himself. "Man overreached," Cale said once, nodding at the broken line of fence. His pa did. Set out to fence a bigger life than the one he could hold. Paid for it. Boy's been paying since. He did not say it cruelly, he said it the way old men say true things, letting them land. Gretchen looked at the leaning posts. She looked at the far ridge where the grass grew greener than it had any right to over dry ground. She did not answer. But she had already begun, without meaning to do the thing her father had trained into her before she could read Scripture. She had begun to read the land, and the land was telling her a story the men on it had stopped listening to. The homestead sat 9 miles out. A sod house with a half-finished plank addition open at one corner to the sky, a barn on one hinge, a windmill and a water tower, and a corral built expecting a larger life than the one currently inside it. And at the west edge of the yard, near a low rise, a fresh wooden cross, its wood still pale, the grass around it not yet grown back. Gretchen looked at the cross once and then did not look at it again, because a thing like that is a man's to speak of and not a stranger's to stare at. Frank Halloran came out of the barn wiping his hands on a rag. He was lean and weathered, several days unshaven, and his dark eyes were tired in the particular way of a man recently defeated. His jaw was set with the stubbornness of somebody who had been failing at something for months and had not yet found a way to stop. He favored his left shoulder. He looked at the woman on the buckboard and at the rifle across her knees and at the milk pail, and something crossed his face that was not welcome and not unwelcome. It was surprise that a person had actually come. "You're the one answered the notice," he said. Short, flat, he did not offer his hand. "I am," she said. It was nearly the first thing she had said all day. "It's 90 days," Frank said. "Milk the 2 cows morning and evening, salt the beef when we cull, keep the house. I can pay what the notice said and not a dollar over, and I'll tell you plain, it's less than the work is worth." He said the last part looking at the dirt because it shamed him and because he was a man who let true things land even when they cost him. Grisha climbed down without being asked. She took her trunk down herself. She looked at the sod house and the leaning fence and the thin cattle and a half-built room open to the sky, and she said 90 days, and she carried her trunk inside. The inside of the house told her more than the man had. There was a rope bed with a single blanket folded with military precision, a cook stove gone cold, tin cups, a clay jug, 4 tins on a shelf, and 3 of them near empty. And on the door pegs, a well-oiled Winchester that was not hers, a dead person's rifle, kept clean by a living person's grief. She looked at the 2 rifles, hers and the one on the pegs, and understood something about the house without a word being spoken. This was a place that kept the tools of the dead in good order. That told her the people here had loved somebody who worked and had not forgiven the ground for taking them. That first evening she milked the 2 cows and found them poorly, their yield thin, their coats rough. She salted nothing because there was nothing yet to cull. She made a supper out of near-empty tins and a little flour and set more food on the table than, Cale said later, they had had it once in a while. Frank ate in silence. Cale ate in silence. She ate in silence. But the old man's shoulders came down another half-inch, and when he stood to go to the barn he said, "Quiet." Obliged, which from Cale was a speech. Before she slept she took stock of the house the way she took stock of everything. Quiet and complete. 3 tins near empty, 1/2 full. A sack of flour with weevils she would sift out. Coffee enough for 2 weeks if a person was careful, and she was always careful. A little salt pork. No sugar. No milk kept back for the house because both cows were being milked poorly and dry by evening. She wrote none of it down. She did not need to. She had a memory for accounts that her father had drilled into her across 100 cold Iowa mornings, saying a woman who keeps the count in her head cannot have it taken from her. She had believed him. She still did. She slept in the half-finished room that first night, with a canvas over the open corner and the plains, starlight brittle and clear through the gap, and she lay awake listening to the wind push at the door, and she thought about the far ridge and the green grass over dry ground, and she filed that away too. And then she breathed out slow and steady and slept. Morning came, the color of a bruise fading, and she was up before it. She milked in the blue dark. She walked the near pasture while the cows chewed, and she read the ground the way her father had taught her, kneeling to the grass, thumbing the soil, following the low places where water would run if there were water to run. She found the creek running low, but running. She found the old fence line, 11 posts leaning, a father's overreach. And she found, on the far side of the low ridge, a soft, muddy scar in the ground where the greener grass grew, a spring silted over, choked with years of washed-down soil, still weeping enough moisture to green the grass above it, but not enough to run. She knelt over the silted spring a long time. She did not tell anyone that first morning. She wanted to be certain. She had learned to be certain before she spoke, because a woman who is only sometimes right is not listened to, and a woman who is always right when she finally speaks is. She walked the far pasture end to end and paced it off, counting her steps into acres the way her father had taught her. And she found it the best ground on the place and the least used, because the men had grazed the near pasture bare out of habit and let the far one sit because it was a longer walk to water. She stood on the low ridge and looked back at the whole 160 acres laid out below her in the early light, and she saw it entire. The bare near pasture, the green far one, the low creek. The choked spring, the leaning fence, the thin scattered cattle, and she saw, the way you see a whole word after spelling out the letters, that the place was not ruined. The place was only misread. Every wrong thing on it was a wrong reading, not a wrong land. That was a different problem, and a solvable one, and she felt the old set-aside part of her come awake and stretch like a thing that had been asleep too long. She said nothing. She went back down the ridge and milked the evening cows. The days settled into work. She milked morning and evening, and within 2 weeks the 2 cows gave more and better, because she fed them right and handled them steady, and Frank noticed the pails coming in heavier, and said nothing, but noticed. She mended what she could reach. She kept the house. And in the hours that were hers she walked the land, all 160 acres of it. And she read it the way some people read a Bible, front to back and then back to front, until she knew it. There was a small early cull that first month, 3 old cows past their use, and it was then Frank saw for the first time that the woman he had hired to salt beef knew how to salt beef the way a master knows a craft. She dressed and cut and layered the meat in the crocks with a speed and a cleanness that stopped Cale in the doorway, and she wasted nothing, and what she put down that month kept sweet clear through the summer when other men's salt beef went off. Frank had advertised for the chore the way a drowning man reaches for the nearest board, not knowing or caring what the board was made of. He did not yet understand that he had reached out in the dark and caught hold of the one person for 100 miles who could actually read his way out of the water. He only knew the beef kept, and the pails came in heavy, and the house was warm, and he did not let himself wonder much past that, because wondering was dangerous for a man who had lost as much as he had lost. The 2 cows came around first, because cows are honest and answer to steady handling faster than men do. She fed them the far pasture's grass carried back by the armload, and she milked them at the same hours, in the same way, with the same low, steady voice, and their yield came up week over week until the pails came in heavy, and she was setting milk and butter on the table and putting the surplus down in the cool of the sod house. Frank noticed the butter. He noticed the table. He noticed a house that had been going cold and empty for 3 years coming, slowly, back to a kind of life, and he did not know what to do with the noticing, so he did nothing with it, which is what men like Frank Halloran do with feeling until they cannot any more. Cale noticed too, and Cale, being old, was less afraid of it. He took to lingering at the table after supper. He took to telling her things, where the old tack was, which of the cattle were the man's father's stock and which the son had bought, and once, in the flat way he said everything, that the cross at the west edge of the yard was Frank's wife, dead of a fever 2 winters back, and that Frank had not been the same man since, and that the calving records were kept in a canvas book in the tack room if she ever had need of them. He did not know he was handing her the whole story. He was only an old man talking to the first person in 3 years who set a full table and listened without needing to be looked at. Frank watched her walking his ground and did not understand it. To him the land was a defeat he was serving out a sentence on. To her it was a page. One evening he found her out at the leaning fence line, crouched, sighting down the post the way a carpenter sights a board. They lean because the ground shifts under the frost and nobody reset them, she said, before he could ask. Set them again in the fall, after the ground moves, not the spring before it does, and they'll stand. She stood, brushed her hands on her apron. Your father set them in spring. Frank was quiet. How would you know when my father set them? The lean tells you, she said. Same lean, same direction, every post. That's not weather. That's a season. He looked at the 11 posts all leaning the same way, and he saw, for the first time, what she saw. And something moved behind his tired eyes that was the beginning of a different kind of looking. He did not thank her. He was not a man who thanked easily, but that night he set a second tin plate on the shelf next to the first, and she understood the smallness and the size of it both. Cale had thawed by then. He had thawed, he told her once, the first day, watching her climb down off the buckboard without waiting to be helped. Woman that won't wait to be helped, he said, won't wait to be beat, either. He showed her where the good tack was and where the calving records were kept, and it was Cale who put into her hands, one gray afternoon, the thing that would turn the whole story. It was a canvas-bound ledger, a calving book, and when she opened it, she saw it was written in 2 different hands, one older, cramped, careful, a woman's study hand, and one newer, looser, a man's. The older hand ran for years, recording every cow, every bull, every calf, every bloodline, every hard winter and easy spring, in a careful account of what the land could carry and what it could not. And then the older hand stopped, abruptly, one spring, mid-season, mid-page. and the newer hand picked it up without a blank line between them, as though the writer could not bear to leave even a single empty space where the other hand had been. She understood the cross in the yard then. She did not ask. She read. She sat with a ledger in her lap in the last of the daylight, and she turned back to the very first page where the older cramped hand had begun years before, and she read it the way her father had taught her to read any account, not for the numbers alone, but for the mind behind the numbers, the intention a person leaves in the margins of the work they do. And she saw straight off that the woman who had begun this book had not been keeping a chore record. She had been keeping a plan. Gretchen had seen a great many bad ledgers in her life, ledgers kept the way a person shovels a walk, only to have the thing done. This was not one of those. This was the ledger of somebody who had loved the land and meant to win. If you've come this far into Griege's story, hit subscribe, because what she found in that ledger is the part I've been waiting to tell you. She read the calving book by lamplight 3 nights running, the amber turned low to save oil, her finger moving down the careful columns, and on the 3rd night she stopped and went back and read a run of pages again and sat very still. The dead woman, Frank's first wife, whose hand had filled the older columns, whose cross stood at the west edge of the yard, had not just kept records. She had been building something. Line by line, season by season, she had been breeding for the land itself. She had been culling the cattle that could not hold flesh on dry grass and keeping the ones that could, breeding the hardy to the hardy. Writing beside each keeper a small note in her cramped, careful hand, holds flesh, easy caver, does well on the far pasture, drinks little. She had been assembling, one calf at a time, a herd shaped to survive exactly the land that was killing everyone else's cattle. She had been most of the way there when the older hand stopped. And Frank, grieving, had not known what he was holding. He had read the ledger as a record of loss. He had been culling by the wrong measure, selling off the very cows his wife had spent years selecting, the plain hard-holding animals that did not look like much, and keeping the pretty heavy ones that ate the pasture down to dirt and dropped weight the first dry month. He had been undoing her work without knowing it was work. He had been unbuilding the one thing that could have saved him, because grief had made him read the wrong story in his own dead wife's hand. Grieche sat with that a long time. 41 head of cattle stood on that land. She had counted them the first day. Of the 41, she now knew by the ledger 11 were the dead woman's keepers, the hard-holding plain ones, the ones with the small careful notes beside their numbers, 11 leaning posts, 11 right cows. The land kept telling her the same number. She went back through the ledger a 4th time to be sure of it, matching the numbers in the book against the cattle she had walked among for weeks, and she found she could put a face to nearly every keeper. The plain roan that held her flesh through the lean end of winter, the small dun cow that had calved alone in a far corner and brought the calf in herself, the long-bodied brindle that drank from the low creek and never seemed to want for water. She had noticed all of them already in her weeks of reading the herd and marked them in her own head as the good ones, the ones worth keeping, before she had ever opened the book. And here they were in a dead woman's hand, marked exactly the same. 2 careful women, 10 years apart, one living and one dead, had read the same 41 cows and picked the same 11. It was as near to speaking with the dead as Gretchen ever expected to come, and it settled something in her and hardened her purpose. Because now it was not only her judgment she was carrying forward. It was a promise she had somehow made to a woman she would never meet. She did not go to Frank that night. She was certain now, but certainty is not the same as being heard, and she knew that a grieving man told he had been undoing his dead wife's work would hear an accusation and not a rescue. So she waited. She kept the 11 keepers back from the next cull herself quietly, moving them to the far pasture near the silted spring where the grass ran green, and she let Frank sell the pretty heavy ones he meant to sell, and she said nothing, and she watched. It cost her something to wait. She was a person who had spent her whole life being right about things nobody let her be right about out loud. And here at last was the largest right thing she had ever known, sitting in her lap in a dead woman's careful hand, and she had to hold it and say nothing and let a man make a poor sale she could have stopped. But she had learned the shape of grief in her own father's house, and she knew that a grieving person does not need to be corrected. A grieving person needs to be handed a way through so gently that they believe they found it themselves. So she carried the knowledge like a full pail, spilling none of it, and she watched Frank, and she waited for the day he would be ready to be shown, and she trusted that the land itself would help her make the day come. The cull came. The buyer from the railhead paid poorly for the heavy cattle because the dry summer was coming and everyone knew it, and Frank stood in the corral dust with a thin roll of bills that would not cover the note coming due in the fall, and his jaw was set the way a man sets his jaw when he is watching the last of a thing go. Grisha stood at the rail and watched him watch it. She did not gloat. This genre does not gloat. She only saw a man being outread by his own dead wife and not yet knowing it, and she felt for him. That night she opened the ledger on the table between them and turned it to face him and set her finger on the older, cramped hand. "This is her account," she said. "Not a record of what died, a plan for what could live." She moved her finger down the small, careful notes. "Holds flesh. Easy caver. Does well on the far pasture." She wasn't writing down what happened to your cattle. She was choosing them. She spent years breeding a herd that could carry itself on this exact ground, and she was nearly done. She turned a page. You've been selling the ones she chose and keeping the ones she'd have culled. Not from carelessness, from grief. You read the book as a headstone. It was a set of instructions. Frank did not speak for a long time. His hands, flat on the table, did not move. He looked at the two hands on the page, the older one and his own, running together with no blank line between them, and Grisha watched him understand what he had been doing. And she watched it hurt him worse than the poor sale had, and then she watched something else come up under the hurt. Not shame, though there was shame, but a kind of terrible relief. Because it meant it was not hopeless. It meant somebody had already done the hard thinking. It meant his dead wife had left him a way through, and he had only failed to read it. And failing to read a thing can be undone. "How many did she choose?" he said. His voice was low. 11 are left," Gritchy said. "I kept them back from the cull. They are on the far pasture." She paused, and then she gave him the rest of it, because he was ready now. There's a spring under that pasture, silted over, weeping enough to green the grass, but not to run. Clear it, and you double the water on this place. Her keepers, plus that water, plus one full calving season done her way, she stopped. She did not oversell it. Her father had taught her that too. "It's not nothing," she said. "It might be everything." Frank Halloran looked at the woman he had hired to milk the cows and salt the beef, and he saw her for the first time all the way. Not the cheap labor the 90-day notice had asked for, but a person who had read his land and his ledger and his grief more clearly than he had, and had done it without once making him small. "Show me the spring," he said. They cleared it together through the hot end of summer, the three of them, Gretchen and Frank and Cale, digging out years of silted soil by hand and by mule and by the rusted cultivator dragged down off its square nails on the barn wall. It was brutal work in the dry heat, and there were days the spring wept no more than it had, and Frank's jaw went tight with the fear that she had been wrong. She was not wrong. She was only early. On a morning in the first week of September, with the sky the color of a bruise fading, the far side of the dig went suddenly dark and wet, and then the spring came up clean and cold and steady out of the ground, and it ran. It ran down through the far pasture and pooled and ran on, and the three of them stood in the mud and watched water move across ground that had been dry since before the dead. Woman's hand had stopped. Cale took off his battered hat. He did not say anything. Frank knelt down and put his hand flat in the running water like a man checking that a thing was real. Gretchen stood a little apart, as she always stood, and watched the water find the low places she had followed on her knees that first cold morning, and she breathed out slow and steady and let herself, for one moment, be glad. Word of the spring got out the way things get out on the plains, wagon to wagon, feed store to church step. And that was when the neighbors began to come, in the quiet frontier way, without being asked. Ada Beck, a widow from the next section over, came with a jar of honey and a question. "You need help with the salting come the cull?" And then came back the next morning, whether Gretchen had answered or not, and stayed to work. Tom Otteson, whose own place was small and steady, drove over with a spare hinge for the barn door and a thermos of coffee and the sentence, "Man told me you found water." Figured I'd see it. Old Reuben Pike, who had watched a dozen homesteads fail on that stretch and buried 2 wives of his own, came with a whetstone and sharpened every blade on the place and said almost nothing, and came back the following week to do it again. They were widows and widowers and hard-used old settlers, the ones the land had already taken from and not finished with, and they knew a rising operation when they saw one, and they came to be near it and to help it up. Because on the frontier, a place that climbs lifts the ones around it. But the frontier does not give a thing without first taking something to see if you mean it. The winter of that year came early and came hard. A freeze rolled down off the high plains in the last week of October, weeks before anyone was ready, and it came with a wind that pushed at the door all night and drove the cattle into the fence corners. The note on the land came due in November, a real sum, owed to a bank in the rail town, the last overreach of a dead father passed down to a living son. And the poor summer sale had not covered it, and the buyer would not come again until spring. And in the worst of it, in the black cold, calving started early too. Out of season, the 11 keepers dropping calves in the sleet weeks before they should have. That was the darkest hour, and it did not announce itself. It came as work, the way real trouble always does. Gretchen did not weep and Frank did not despair, because that is not how these people met hardship. They met it with competence, in the cold, without speeches. She had read in the dead woman's ledger, in one of the small, cramped notes beside a keeper's number, 4 words, "Easy calver calves, early." She had filed that away in the summer. Now in the freezing dark, it was the only map they had. The dead woman had known these cows calved early. The dead woman had chosen them partly for it. A cow that calves in the cold on its own, unhelped, holds its calf where a fussed-over pretty animal loses it. So Grisha went out into the freeze with a lantern and her father's Winchester across her shoulder against the wolves that come to a calving ground. And she did not try to stop the early calving, because you cannot stop it, and she did not try to bring the cows in, because moving them in that cold would kill more than it saved. She did what the ledger said the dead woman would have done. She let the hard-holding cows do the thing they had been bred to do. The first night was the worst. The sleet came in sideways, and the lantern guttered, and one of the young cows went down hard in her calving in the corner of the far pasture, and Grisha knelt in the frozen mud in the dark and read the trouble with her hands the way she read everything, and turned the calf, and it came, and it lived, and she rubbed it dry with sacking until its ribs began to work. She could not feel her fingers by then. Frank found her there at the gray edge of morning, still kneeling over the calf. And he did not say a word. He only took off his own coat and put it around her shoulders over her father's rifle and knelt down in the mud beside her and took up the next watch. And the two of them stayed there in the cold, not speaking. And it was, though neither said so, the closest thing to a proposal either of them had yet made. She stood watch over the herd 3 nights of sleet, and Frank stood the watch with her, and Cale stood it with his knees complaining the whole time, and Ada Beck came out on the second night with hot broth and stayed, and Reuben Pike came on the third with dry sacking and a second lantern and stayed. And between all of them and the 11 cows that a dead woman had chosen for exactly this, they brought 9 calves through a freeze that killed cattle on every other place in the county. 9 calves. She had counted them at first light on the third morning, steam rising off their wet backs, the sky going from bruise to gold. And she had leaned on the corral rail so tired she could barely stand, and Frank had come and leaned on the rail beside her, close but not touching, and neither of them had said anything, because there was nothing to say that the 9 calves were not already saying. 9 calves out of 11 cows through a freeze that had come 3 weeks early. On the Otteson place they lost 4 of 6. On the 2 big operations to the south, the ones with the pretty heavy stock, they lost cattle by the dozen, grown cows going down in the drifts and not getting up. Because a pretty cow that has never had to hold flesh on hard grass has nothing in reserve when the reserve is all that keeps it alive. The dead woman had known that. She had written it in her cramped, careful hand years before, one keeper at a time. A cow that lives through a bad night without a man's help is worth 3 that need him. Grisha had read the sentence in the summer and filed it away. In the freeze, she had watched it come true 9 times over. She stood at the rail in the gold morning and thought about the woman under the cross at the west edge of the yard. And she felt something she had not expected to feel for a stranger she would never meet, a kind of kinship, one careful hand to another across the space of a grave. The note still came due. That was the last hard thing, and before they could ride to meet it there was the winter's work to turn into something a banker could count, and that work was the very work Frank had hired her for and never once thought would amount to anything. She salted the fall's culled beef the way her father's people had salted for generations, in careful layered crocks packed tight and clean. And it kept, and it sold for good money because it was done right. She had built the 2 poorly cows into a small dairy, milk and butter, set down in the cool, sold in the rail town, a steady trickle of coin coming in where before there had been only coin going out. The milking and the salting, the two small chores a defeated man had advertised for in the Amarillo Weekly Courier because they were all he could think to ask, had become, in her hands, the working capital that carried the whole place through to spring. He had hired her to do the smallest things. She had made the smallest things into the thing that saved him. Gretchen and Frank rode into the rail town in the first week of December with a wagon of the fall's culled beef, salted and packed by her hand. The salting he had hired her for turned into the thing that carried them, and the milk and butter she had built up from two poorly cows now giving rich, and the promise of a spring calf crop the like of which the county had not managed through the freeze. The banker had meant to take the land. He was a careful man, and the note was overdue, and the dead father's overreach was the bank's by rights. But Frank Halloran laid the salted beef and the butter and the ledger on the banker's desk, the ledger in two hands open to the plan, and he did a thing he had not been able to do in 3 years of grief. He explained what the land could carry. Not what it had lost, what it could carry. He had learned to read it. She had taught him to read it, without ever once telling him he could not. The banker extended the note. Careful men extend notes to operations that are climbing, and for the first time in 3 years, the Halloran place was climbing, and any banker with eyes could see the climb in the salted beef and the fat butter and the 11 right cows and the spring running clear. They rode home in the early dark with the note extended and the winter half beaten, and somewhere on the west road Frank said, not looking at her, "You could have told me the first month. About the ledger, the spring, all of it." "I could have," Gretchen said. "Why didn't you?" She thought about how to say it. A man grieving hears an accusation where a woman means a rescue, she said finally. "I wanted you to hear the rescue. So I waited until you could." She looked out at the dark plains. "And I wanted to be certain. A woman who's only sometimes right doesn't get a second sentence. So I make sure the first one's true." Frank was quiet a long way down the road. Then he said, "The 90 days were up in August." "I know," she said. "You stayed." "I did," she said. He did not say anything else that night, but the next morning he began work on the half-finished room, the one open at the corner to the sky, and he closed it in against the winter, plank by plank. And he did not say why, and she did not ask, because some things a man says with a hammer that he cannot say with his mouth. The spring calving came, done her way, done the dead woman's way, and it came rich, the 11 keepers throwing strong calves on the doubled water and the far green pasture, and the calves growing out hard and plain and thriving where the county's pretty cattle faltered in the next dry summer. Frank bred by the ledger now. He kept the hard holders and sold the pretty ones. The exact reverse of everything grief had him doing, and the herd came up the way a dead woman had planned it to come up, and within 3 years the Halloran place carried the most cattle of any operation on that stretch of the high plains. Not the prettiest cattle, but the ones that lived. Which on that ground was the only measure that had ever mattered. The years of the rebuild ran together the way good hard years do. There was the summer they ran a proper ditch off the spring and put a second stock tank in the far pasture, Reuben Pike surveying the fall of the land by eye, and Gretchen checking his eye against her father's arithmetic, and the two of them agreeing to the inch. There was the autumn they reset the whole fence line after the ground moved, Frank and Cale and Tom Otteson setting posts, while Grie walked ahead of them, reading the frost heave in the soil and marking where each post should go, and every post they set that fall still stood. There was the winter she finished, at last the plank room that had stood open to the sky. Or rather the winter Frank finished it for her, plank by plank, and the spring she whitewashed it. There was the milk house they built, and the second team of mules, and a day the general store woman in the rail town, who had once watched Gria through the glass, walked out onto the boardwalk to ask her plainly what she thought the grass would do that year, and listened to the answer. Steady work, steady years, coin coming in where coin had only gone out. The place settled into prosperity the way it had once settled into ruin, quietly, a season at a time, until one day a person looked up and saw it had happened. The fence got reset in the fall after the ground moved, and it stood. All 11 posts stood. Cale said his knees still had opinions, but the fence had none any more. The barn got its second hinge. The corral, built to expect a larger life than the one it had held, finally held it. And people in the rail town, who had said the name Holleran in the low way of the already decided, began to say it a different way, and the general store woman who had watched Grisha through the glass began instead to ask her opinion on the weather and the grass. Because it turned out the Dutch woman was always right when she finally spoke. Frank and Grisha married in the spring of the second year, quietly, without much said, the way everything true on that place got done. There was no speech. He had never been a man for speeches, and she had never needed one. He asked her plainly, standing at the fence line one evening with his hat in his hands. And he did not dress it up, and she would not have believed him if he had. He said only that the 90 days had been up a long time now, and he did not want to count days any more. She said she did not either. That was the whole of the asking. He built a second chair for the porch, plain and sturdy, set beside his own, facing west into the sundown. And the building of the second chair was the whole of what he had to say, and it was enough, and she knew it was enough, and she sat in it. Ida Beck came for the wedding with a whole roast in a jar of the honey, and Reuben Pike came in a clean shirt and stood in the back and said it was a fine thing, and went home before dark. And Cale stood up with Frank because there was no one else and no one else was needed, and the old ranch hand's knees had, he allowed, no opinions at all that day. It was a small wedding on a place the whole territory would one day drive out of its way to see, and there was nothing about it that anyone would have called grand, and it was the truest thing that ground had held in a generation. She never stopped carrying her father's Winchester when she walked the fence line. It was worn smooth now at the grip from 30 years of her hand, and she cleaned it of an evening the way the house had always cleaned the tools of its dead, and she taught the working of it, in time, to a girl the Ottisons fostered, passing the knowing on the way it had been passed to her. Because knowing that is not passed on dies with the hand that holds it, and she had spent her whole life refusing to let good knowing die. And she never stopped keeping the dead woman's ledger, adding to it now in a third hand that ran on under the second the way the second had run on under the first no blank pages, because a thing that is carried forward does not leave gaps. The inheritance on that place was never cash. It was knowledge and intention, and one woman's careful hand teaching another woman's careful eye across the space of a grave how to read a dying land into a living one. 30 years later, a traveler stopped on the west road to water his horse at a spring that ran clear and cold and steady out of the ground. In the shade of a fence line, every post of which stood true, on a homestead that the whole territory had by then long called the jewel of the frontier. There was an old woman out at the fence, working it with the same economy of motion she must have had at 31. A Winchester laid across her shoulder like a yoke worn so long she no longer felt the weight of it. And beside the porch 2 plain chairs faced west, one of them empty now, kept as clean and well-oiled as any dead man's rifle. The traveler tipped his hat and asked her who owned this place. The old woman set down her hammer and looked out at the running spring and the standing fence and the fat plain cattle grazing the far green pasture the way a dead woman had planned it 30 years before. And she was quiet a while, filing the question away the way she had filed everything away her whole long life. "A man hired me to milk his cows," she said at last. "I read the rest of it myself. She was 31 when she stepped off the stage into Delwood with a milk pail and her father's rifle, and Cale had watched her climb down without waiting to be helped, and Frank Halloran had learned. Plank by plank and post by post and calf by calf, to read the land she read. The sun went down gold over the water she had found, and the old woman put her hand flat on the fence her husband had helped her set, the way a man once put his hand flat in a running spring to be sure it was real. The frontier never handed anyone a thing, but it kept, quietly, whatever a steady hand was willing to carry forward, and a woman the whole world had hired as cheap help had carried forward more than any of them, and made it her own, one season at a time, without ever once raising her voice.